everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we are going to be continuing the discussion regarding reparations and the creation of the roles. But I want to bring your attention to this very important issue regarding naming and the socio-political dynamics related to the names that different groups of people have been given over time, particularly related to the United States Census and perhaps other census records in other countries. So we're going to go over some of the names that have been given to the varieties of groups in relation to the issue of reparations, in relation to the issue of determining family heritage, and basically just disentangling this mess that has been made of racial classification, this issue of identity theft and confusion, and what has now become shared identities. So you'll have one group that has a name that's shared by another group. You can use Indians, for instance. So you've got Indians from the country of India, and then you have Indians that are in the United States, then you have Indians that are in the Caribbean. And so this issue of this shared naming and then bringing those groups of people together in one space with these variations in terms of meaning with these names, we're going to cover all of that and what the implications are for that in terms of your research. Now, one of the things I want to point out to you is that there are a couple of researchers, it's Hochschild and Powell, back in 2008 out of Harvard. They did some research looking at the racial reorganization in the United States and looking at the census between 1850 and 1930. And they were looking at this issue of racial reclassification and classification and looking at how people were placed into different racial categories. Specifically, how did people get classified as a mulatto? How did someone get classified as a half-breed? And so they were also looking at issues related to mixed parenting. And so one of the things that they pointed out was that between the Civil War and the World War II in the United States, there was like a variety of all of these complex systems of how to organize people racially. And often between that time, these racial categories were expanded or constricted, and they were reorganizing social boundaries and actual recognized groups and renaming groups of people, just giving them whatever name they wanted to give them. All of this blurring of all of these ethnic lines and altering social and political identity just across the board. Now, one group that they note pretty much stayed the same, and by stayed the same, it's stayed the same in terms of name, and that stayed the same in terms of name is white. But who actually fit in that category of that white identifier, it changed over time, just like who was classified as black changed over time, or color changed over time. But that name white has stayed the same, even though the ingress and egress in terms of that particular group has been altered over time. Now, one of the important things that they point out is that those who were considered black or Chinese, there was sort of a battle for who would be at the bottom of the bottom. And so there was extensive experimentation in terms of reorganizing and re-imaging this racial order and creating this stratification, and all of the levels of government and all of the branches of government were involved in this process of racial reorganization. And by branches of government, what's meant by that is you have the legislative branch, they are making the laws. You have the executive branch, they're enforcing the laws. And then you have the judicial branch, and they're interpreting the laws that have been created. And then you have the different levels of government. So you have the local level of government, or what you might call the municipal level of government, then you have the state level of government, and then you have the federal level of government. So they're basically saying all of these entities were involved in this process of racial reorganization. Some of their quotes are very interesting. One quote is, "A nation's census is deeply implicated in and helps to construct its social and political order." Another quote is, "A census both creates the image and provides the mirror of that image for a nation's self-reflection." And they go on to say, in another quote, "In the United States, the social and political order was largely defined by race." And they go on to note that in any single year and across the decades, that racial categorization, it was internally incoherent, it was inconsistent, it was unstable, and there was this sort of game playing with mixtures of this identity of Black. And so, how much Black did a person have in them, and how much white did a person have in them, and that being a determining factor in terms of that racial classification. And as you look at the screen, if you are looking at the screen and not just listening to the video, if you look at the screen, you can see why I have indicated in various videos that you cannot focus on things like skin color and phenotype in terms of controlling the narrative regarding that cutoff for the role. So if people are involved in creating roles, you can't sort of be the arbiter of, who gets included in the role based upon your arbitrary definition of who should be on the roll. And so you can't say things like biracials can't be on the roll, or Black Africans can't be on the roll, or Moors or Indians or Jews or Muslims or white passing people can't be on the rolls. It really needs to fit under the guidelines that have been provided so that you make sure that you capture all of those descendants. And so if you're really looking for descendants of a particular time period, you really need to include all of those people. And then all of that can be teased out later on in terms of, we talked about unclean hands. So you can tease all of that out later, because this is a really complex history going on and a very complex dynamic with this naming and this sort of name game. And so you can see up on the screen all of the different iterations of these groupings. And so a person who is now identified as African American, they may be descended from people who were variously referred to as any one of these names. And so when you're doing your research, you want to be on the lookout actually for all of these names, because sometimes it may not be clear that the person was descendant of what many are saying, calling it chattel slavery. So descendant of American chattel slavery. It may not be clear simply by looking at skin color or looking at surname or looking at whatever they were called, because someone could be called Black Irish, and that's a shared identity, meaning you've got more than one group being referred to by that name. A person could be a person of color. Once they are freed and identified as a free person of color, particularly those down in Haiti, there was this giving them, in many cases, the identity that was really close to slave owner status, and many of them owned slaves. And so you really just have to include everyone until you get a chance to start looking through histories and, parsing things a little bit better. But all of these names that you see on the screen are names that people have been variously referred to in terms of collectives. And it's important to be on the lookout for all of these names, because you just don't know what you're going to find when you're looking, and you don't want to have a closed mind. The other thing is in terms of identity, even some of the negative names that are on the screen, you have to, in a way, claim all of it. Okay, so all of those words that you see on the screen, all of those identifiers, from slave to West Indian to Hebrew to copper colored and red Indian to Black Dutch to African American to African to Morisco, Negro, you have to claim it all, okay? Because what's happened is that in playing this name game, they've changed heritage, and so someone may they may erroneously refrain from claiming a heritage because they see that name. And when you're looking at the totality of your history, it encompasses all of this. And so you don't want to give anything away. There's a YouTube video where there's a discussion about the word black and the word black being a curse, and that, the word should be bronze now. Now, in referring to people, I will refer to people as brown to have this more encompassing identity. However, if you just start to reject the word black, or you reject colored, or you reject Negro, what's going to happen is you're going to actually give up your history, because at different points in time, people were calling many people different things. And so if you give up those names because they sound offensive to you, you are going to inadvertently give up your history, and you're going to give it to someone else, because a large number of these identifiers, they're shared by another group. And so if you're willing to give it up, then it will just belong to them. And so if you're willing to give up African American, well, those who come to the United States from Africa now in present times who want to identify as African American, they can take that identity over if that's an identity that you are willing to give up. Same thing with colored, same thing with Negro, same thing with Indian. If you are willing to give it up, there is someone waiting in line to take that identity. So again, in many ways, you have to just claim all of it, because there have been so many games played with these names. Okay, one of the things to remember is that no one knows exactly how each brown person came to be here in the Americas. Some people were already here. Some people moved here. There was a lot of transitioning between the Americas. So people might have been coming from the islands. People from what is the continental United States might have been going to Mexico, going to Canada, going down to the islands. And so you've got all of this movement going on. So you really don't know how each and every person came to be here. And then there were lots of people who came from the European Isles. And we're going to get into that a bit later, because there are some competing narratives about slavery coming from the European Isles. And so that's a big issue, and it's related to the Barbary slave trade also. You don't know if people came from what was known as Negro land, if they came from other parts of Africa, if they came from the Pacific Islands. And so there are a variety of ways that people have transitioned to be in America, or they have already been here in America. And so you really can't parse it out at this point. People really have to do their own individual histories to figure out how they got here. How they got here may not be as important as what their families experienced being here. And so, slavery for a person who came from Jamaica and was in the United States and was enslaved, it's going to feel the same way as slavery for someone who came from Negro land, or someone who came from Ireland, or someone who was already indigenous in the land and in place, colonized and enslaved. And so you just really don't know. Each person's history is going to be a little different, and oftentimes, as you can imagine, it's going to be mixed. There's going to be a mixed bag. They're going to have ancestors that are all over the place, because people were not always necessarily able to stick within their lineage the way they might have wanted to, and people were so mobile in many ways for many groups. You also can't, there's been a lot of discussion about, whether it's matrilineal or patrilineal descent. Um, Really, I don't think that at this point that's something that people should be debating about or arguing about. There were tribes. Let's just say you're talking about people who are indigenous to the Americas. There were some tribes that were matrilineal. There are some tribes that were patrilineal, and some had some other things going on. The number of tribes is just huge. Okay, so it's not really possible to start coming up with these definitive things based upon some arbitrary sense of what everyone should have been doing in terms of tracing their heritage. Right now, the thing to do would be to simply trace the heritage. And it really doesn't matter in terms of creating those roles for people who were born, in the 60s, prior to the 60s. In terms of looking for records, you can look, I mean, there's so many places that records exist. It's some places that many people wouldn't even think to look for. Some of them would be like orphanage records. There was a time when, and it's hard to know exactly why they were stealing these babies, but there was a time when Irish and German babies were taken from unwed mothers, particularly on the East Coast. They were taken from them and put on orphan trains and taken to different places and given to other people. And so there was this sort of orphan abduction going on and sending the children west. Okay, so far west, far away from where they were. And so these were done by the Catholic Church and religious organizations. And so you want to look at orphanage records. You might find some information in there, particularly when you have a group of people known as the Black Irish, the Black Dutch, and the Black Scottish. And so, it's possible that they were just calling them that because their hair was black, or because, some other meaning that they attached to black. But the likelihood that people were just running around arbitrarily identifying people as black anything is slim to none. So you do want to look at those records. Of course, you're looking at census records. Another thing to do is look at surnames and look at when your surname came into the country. And so that can give you some idea of where your heritage might be. Some of you are going to find that your surnames did not come from the quote unquote slave master. Many individuals have those names, those European sounding names, because their ancestors were married to someone with a European name. They came over from Europe with that European name, and they were black. There might have, been marriages that were either common law or regular marriages, and they have that name. They could have been escaping persecution. They could have been persecutors, okay? And they could have had that name. Some of the names to be on the lookout for, of course, would be, if you're checking that history, would be Cromwell, and names like Stuart. And so there's some significant history related to those names. And so you want to be on the lookout for that. Particularly, the people in Nova Scotia have some interesting surnames. And so definitely, just be out on the lookout for that. Looking at boat searches, who came in on what ships. You can also look at court records and things like jail records and prison records. There was a convict leasing program that was going on. Also, in terms of Africa, people are, trying to look up some stuff over in Africa. Ghana pretty much has some information. And one of the words you want to look for when you're looking at stuff in Ghana or in West Africa, one of the phrases, one of the words, one of the identifiers is Lankato. And so you want to look at that because there was a dynamic going on with the Lankatos. Those were the people who were, cast out of Europe. And during the Inquisition, they were cast out, and a lot of individuals converted to quote unquote Christianity to conceal their identity. So you want to look at, those sorts of things too, in addition to the regular history books and things like that. Now, there have been a few weeks that have passed since I provided the information about the possibility of the rolls. and there's also been 400 years now. And so the basic roles of your family members, your extended family members, church and religious groups, neighborhoods, communities, those roles could have been started by now. So hopefully people have already gotten started on those roles. There's sometimes this expectation, not sometimes, there's this huge expectation that one person is going to take up the charge. And so, people might think, oh, that was, Claude Anderson's task to get all of this stuff together and then present it and do whatever needs to be done with it. That's his role, or that's Yvette Carnell's role. She knows all of the data, so therefore it should be her role to put it together. Or Dane Calloway has, revealed this stuff, and so therefore it should be his job to put this stuff together. Or Fauna should put this stuff together for everyone. I want to point something out to you. There's over 42 million people in the United States going by that classification of Black / African American / Black Caribbean / Black Hispanic. So you've got over 42 million people. And with over 42 million people, it is unreasonable to expect that Yvette Carnell, Claude Anderson, or Dane Calloway should be taking up the charge for doing all of the work that needs to be done. It's just unreasonable. And so with 42 million people, surely if people are really interested in having some sort of restoration, then it is incumbent upon those people to make their issue as important to them as they believe it is or should be to someone else. No one is going to make your issue more important to them than it is to you. And so if you're sitting around waiting for someone to, just offer, some restorative justice, you'll be waiting for a very long time. You've been waiting for 400 years, you'll be waiting for 400 years more. Trust and believe. And one of the reasons why people may not be moving forward is because of all of this distraction and all of these fractions that are being created, of a people. And so you've got all of these different groups, vying for your attention when, your attention, if you say that it's your priority to start to look at restoration, then if you get sidetracked by focusing on Pan-Africanism or this new manosphere or Aboriginal movements or, the Black nationalist movement or the Hebrew Israelite movement or the Moor movement. If you get too caught up in that, then you're not going to be able to come together to create these roles that you need to create to have some forward movement, because the legacy issue is bigger than those different discrete groups. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.